Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on countering proliferation finance. I'm Leonard Spector, Deputy Director of the Jame Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, a research unit at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office. For the past several decades, I've been working on proliferation issues in the U.S. government and at think tanks here in Washington. This webinar is part of a larger project led by the Jame Martin Center, seeking to inform the financial and non-proliferation communities about proliferation finance and means for countering it. The work is funded by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office and is complementary to the Center's extensive activities in the area of strategic trade controls.
And I'm Moyara Ruehsen. I am an associate professor of economics and financial crime here at the Monterey Institute. I'm also a certified anti-money laundering specialist and a financial crime specialist. I currently teach courses in our Graduate School of International Policy and Management on financial crime, everything from trade-based money laundering to terrorism financing, cybercrime, tax evasion, asset recovery, and financial investigations. And next fall, we're going to be adding 2 new courses on forensic accounting. We'll also be rolling out a new accelerated MBA program in financial crime mitigation. If you know of anyone who might be interested in that, please contact us. Our goal today is to familiarize you with proliferation finance, the role that finance plays in WMD proliferation, why the issue is important, and what steps can be taken by governments, suppliers, and the financial community to counter it. Now, just to be clear, when we use the abbreviation WMD, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, although most of the sanctions programs currently in place relate to the nuclear weapons programs of Iran and North Korea. Now, one tool for disrupting WMD programs is to disrupt the financial transactions that are used to obtain dual-use items. And by that we mean items which have both a legitimate industrial use as well as use in a WMD program. There are quite a few countermeasures that seek to constrain proliferation finance in the form of UN resolutions, embargoes, asset recoveries, and asset freezes, and economic sanctions against countries of concern. And my colleague, Leonard Spector, will talk to you about that first. And then I will look at some of the red flags that compliance professionals need to watch out for, which is true for anyone in the business of facilitating trade transactions, whether you're working for a financial institution or maybe you're a manufacturer. And then I will take you through a practice case study.
Although slowing the development of weapons of mass destruction everywhere is an international goal, at the moment, as Moyara said, the Security Council of the United Nations has targeted nuclear activities in only 2 countries as posing threats to international peace and security, and those countries are Iran and North Korea. These also top the list of concerns for the United States, the European Union, and many other nations. As you can see from this slide, Iran does not yet possess nuclear weapons, but has developed the key facilities needed to produce them. The facilities were initially built in secret, but were exposed by others and then placed under international inspection, as required by the fact that Iran is a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is concern that Iran could withdraw from that treaty and rapidly produce nuclear arms. Ongoing negotiations may lead to significant restrictions in this program. North Korea, on the other hand, possesses a small nuclear arsenal already and may be able to mount these weapons on medium-range missiles able to strike South Korea and Japan. It's conducted 3 nuclear tests and is thought to be adding to its nuclear weapons stockpile at the rate of about several nuclear weapons per year. Going to the next slide. Concerns in these 2 countries are focused on sensitive nuclear facilities that can produce material for nuclear weapons, either highly enriched uranium, the material used in the Hiroshima bomb, or plutonium, the material used in the Nagasaki bomb. And here are some samples that you can see. Uranium is enriched, highly enriched uranium is made in uranium enrichment plants, which also can make fuel for nuclear power plants or for research reactors, but they do have this possibility of creating weapon quality fuel. Plutonium is created in reactors when they burn uranium fuel, and then reprocessing plants separate the material so that it may be used for military purposes or sometimes for civilian purposes. Well, let's go to the next slide. Iran, by the way, has 2 major uranium enrichment plants, and North Korea has 1. Iran also is building a reactor that is designed to produce plutonium, although it doesn't have the plutonium separation plant that would be needed to get the plutonium out of the spent fuel. North Korea has a plutonium production reactor and a reprocessing plant, a plutonium separation plant, and it used plutonium, just a second on the slides, go back one please, it used plutonium for its 3 nuclear tests. As we will see, both countries have relied on illegally obtained equipment and materials to build and operate these sensitive facilities. Now this photograph shows the former president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, touring the Natanz uranium enrichment facility in Iran. He's walking past uranium enrichment centrifuges, of which 10,000 are in operation. Inside of these metal tubes that you see are very, very rapidly spinning parts that cause uranium gas to swirl, and it allows the enrichment plant owner to separate out the most desirable atoms of uranium that can eventually, when concentrated enough, make nuclear weapon material, or as I said, if not taken to that level, can make fuel for nuclear power plants. The second photograph on the right, excuse me, just go back one. The second photograph here on the right is a picture of the overhead of the Fordow facility, a second enrichment plant in Iran. And you can see entrances to it. It's built into a mountainside in order to protect the facility from attack. Now the next picture is one in North Korea. And this shows the Yongbyon nuclear complex, a portion of it. To the left is the reactor in which plutonium was produced that was used in North Korea's nuclear tests. And you see a cooling tower being destroyed on the right-hand side. And that's part of a deal that North Korea struck to close down that reactor. But it has since reopened the reactor and is producing plutonium using a different cooling system. Let's go to the next slide. The crucial point here is that all of these facilities depend heavily on high-tech imports. These are very elaborate facilities. Enrichment plants, for example, contain thousands of centrifuges, as I may have said, linked in cascades. The centrifuges operate under vacuum and spin at hypersonic speeds to enrich uranium in a gaseous form up to the level desired. This necessitates especially strong grades of steel, aluminum, and carbon fiber for the moving parts of the centrifuges. The vacuum pumps and equipment are also needed to move the uranium through the facility, and they must be specially designed to be corrosion resistant and to sustain stable pressures within the system. Parts must be made to exacting specifications, necessitating the use of multi-axis machine tools and sophisticated measurement equipment. Neither Iran nor North Korea can produce all of these items itself, and therefore must import them. And as you can see from the slide, high-quality steel, as I mentioned, specialized valves and lubricants, high-end measurement devices, and so forth. All of them are needed in both countries. Let's go to the next slide. Embargoes, however, that are imposed by individual countries and by the United Nations make it impossible for the two countries to acquire these goods legally. And so they are forced to use extensive illegal procurement efforts. We know that there have been hundreds of such efforts every year, attempts of this kind in the United States, Europe, Japan, and South Korea, and there are many more that go undetected. Importantly, as Moyara said earlier, Every one of these transactions must be financed, and therefore for every illegal import, there is an illegal financial transaction to provide payment to the supplier. Most of these attempted procurements are carried out by agents outside of Iran and North Korea at the direction of individuals in those countries. Typically, they'll use false documentation, disguise both the end user and the ultimate destination, transship through multiple countries, work through front companies, and maybe even use diplomatic pouches to move materiel. Now, of course, Sweden's not involved in the illicit transactions. They're one of the best supplier countries in terms of disciplined export controls. But I wanted to show you the use of the diplomatic pouch is not confined just to a courier's satchel. You can have diplomatic protection for very large shipments, and that's how some of these goods are moved. You might wonder how a compliance officer can see past all of this. Well, we'll be showing you some of those tools as we get further into the webinar this evening. Now, just to give you some examples of the kinds of objects that have been obtained by these countries that are actually in use, here is another photograph of President Ahmadinejad at Natanz, and the circled item is a pressure transducer. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of these in this facility, and they are intended to maintain a steady pressure as the uranium gas is moved around the centrifuges and gets enriched, moving from one to the next, and so on. So here's an example. This is an American-made, and we'll be looking pretty carefully at how these particular items got to Iran. But it's an example of a known item purchased abroad illegally that found its way into the plant. Let's go to the next slide. These are 5 different centrifuges that have been manufactured by Iran. The photograph is in a report by a panel of experts that supports a UN sanctions committee, the one that is responsible for watching the implementation of the sanctions imposed against Iran. The labeling by the panel of experts shows that certain components were made in Iran from what the panel called imported, high-strength steel, carbon fiber, or aluminum, all of which were subject to Security Council embargo. And that means the goods were almost certainly obtained illegally. The next slide involves shipments to North Korea. A German individual who procured Japanese origin vacuum pumps for a North Korean nuclear plant. The photos to the left, to the right, show these kinds of this piece of equipment just for illustrations purposes. These are actually in use in a plant in Western Europe. But it gives you a sense of the kinds of goods that are at stake here. One last example, if we go to the next slide, involves the illegal purchase from China of specialized trucks. You'll see them on the right. These multi-axle trucks are intended for use in lumbering, moving timber, very long pieces of timber, and were purchased by North Korea from the Chinese company with an end-user certificate that said they would be used for that purpose, that civilian purpose. But if you see to the left, the truck has been adapted by the North Koreans to serve as a missile platform, a transporter erector launcher. It turns out that particular missile, the KN-08, when it becomes operational, is intended to be aimed at the United States. So this particular dual-use item that found its way out of China to North Korea by fraudulent means has a very significant piece of equipment, certainly from the U.S. perspective. Let's go to the next slide and think about the countermeasures that are available to try to stop some of these efforts. Many of these, that's why we want to talk about them, are focused on the financial dimension of these transfers of nuclear and missile-related goods. These include embargoes, that's the first step, on the transfer of these goods to Iran and North Korea, targeted sanctions that we'll talk about, bans on financing of illicit nuclear trade, and due diligence by financial institutions. Let's continue. So let me just talk about a number of these a few words each. The sources of the rules that apply in these cases are UN Security Council resolutions. You see several of them listed there. US and EU sanctions, and then the Financial Action Task Force Recommendation 7. The Security Council resolutions have all been imposed under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which means these are binding resolutions. These are not simply voluntary declarations by the Council that states are free to adopt. They are required to adopt them. The first one, Resolution 1540, it sort of establishes a baseline. It says that all countries are required to establish controls over weapons of mass destruction and the materials and equipment needed to make them. Among other controls, states must restrict the financing of transfers of relevant goods and services to states of concern. The next two Security Council resolutions, 1929 and 2094, are the resolutions that impose sanctions on Iran and North Korea, including the embargoes on WMD material. They impose targeted sanctions on individuals and entities engaged in proliferation activities, including procurement, and they require bank vigilance to prevent transactions that could contribute to non-proliferation. Unfortunately, the UN resolutions don't have enforcement mechanisms. So in a sense, the principal enforcement mechanism is identification of states that are not implementing the sanctions fully. But it's a very mild way to enforce these rules. The United States and the European Union have imposed more extensive embargoes and sanctions measures, and the United States also imposes secondary sanctions, a point I'll return to shortly. This is a powerful mechanism for encouraging compliance. And finally, on this slide, the 34-member Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, was established in 1989 to preserve the integrity of the international banking system. The organization also supports 7 FATF-style bodies, regional bodies around the world, and so its recommendations really become the global standard for the banking community in areas of money laundering, anti-terrorism finance, and now counter-proliferation finance. In 2012, it added the non-proliferation component to its work and issued Recommendation 7, which instructs member states to implement the asset freezes against parties designated under UN Security Council, Iran, and North Korea sanctions resolutions. And if they don't implement them, they risk being called out in a more explicit way through the FATF's peer reviews and mutual assessments. So there are actual lists of countries who are deemed to be non-cooperative or underperforming, and it's a fairly nasty label that countries seek to avoid. So let's take a look at targeted sanctions for a moment and also compare them to broader economic sanctions, which are also in play, but are less directed at these proliferation transactions we've been talking about. Targeted sanctions focus on specific parties, and they freeze the assets of those parties. Typically, that's the sanction, unless the party is a financial institution, in which case the sanction usually disconnects them from the US and European banking systems. So the targeted sanctions seek to disrupt the financing of illegal procurement activities and to punish those involved. I should stress that when a party's assets are frozen, other parties are also banned from engaging in business with the sanctioned party, because that in effect would either be giving the sanctioned party new assets or allowing the sanctioned party to use his assets to conduct business. And this means, with the sanctioned party isolated in this fashion, the sanctioned party is isolated not only from the financial sector of the sanctioning state because his money is tied up, but also from its commercial sector. Let's look at economic sanctions for just a moment. The goal of economic sanctions is somewhat different. Here, the desire is to dissuade governments from pursuing suspect nuclear programs by weakening the economy of the target state. The focus is not on disrupting individual transactions as such, but at dissuading the target state from continuing with a nuclear or a missile program. Some examples of broad economic sanctions are listed on the slide. And these are the ones that have actually been used and are in use at the moment. Curtailing the purchases of Iranian crude oil, a very powerful sanction. The ending of sales of refined petroleum products to Iran, another tough measure. The end of foreign assistance to North Korea, not fully implemented, but given its a very weak economy, a very powerful tool potentially. And finally, just as another example, there was the denial by the European Union of Iranian bank access to the SWIFT transaction clearing system. This is where the world's checks get cleared, and many other transactions as well. And it has tended to isolate Iran very much from world financial operations. As far as the US is concerned, again, we have targeted sanctions aimed at those who materially assist weapon of mass destruction programs. And as I mentioned, there are the secondary sanctions. The targeted sanctions, I think there are now 700 different parties who have been identified, or at least it's many hundred, who have been identified and are subject to sanctions by the United States. That far exceeds the number that have been sanctioned by the UN Security Council. And sanctioned parties include major Iranian institutions such as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and many banks, Bank Melli and the Central Bank of Iran. So again, these can have a very, very big impact. The secondary sanctions are quite powerful, because they then ban transactions with a sanctioned party. And if you go to the Treasury list, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, you will see that there are sanctioned parties, and the Treasury list warns readers that if you deal with the sanctioned party, you are at risk. It notes very clearly that secondary sanctions apply. So there's a very strong effort to isolate the targeted individuals and organizations. One dimension of these sanctions is that they have an international reach. Even though they are applied by the United States, parties outside the United States who engage in business, let us say, with sanctioned parties, risk losing privileges that the United States does extend them or could extend them, such as using our banking system and engaging in commercial activity in the United States. So the secondary sanction dimension is a very strong warning that many parties take quite seriously, including in particular international banks. And these, I might add, are aggressively enforced, as Moyara will tell us and show in some detail. Hundreds of millions of dollars in fines have been leveled against US and foreign banks because of dealings with sanctioned parties. So let's let me close my, let me come to the end of this portion of my discussion. The prohibited transactions are also listed. So it's not simply that it's illegal to assist a foreign program with, by providing good or a service. It's also prohibited to provide financial support for the program or for one of these transactions. And it's up to financial institutions to implement these measures, because they are the ones who actually process the transactions and must be watchful to avoid transactions that could support proliferation. And the word could is found repeatedly in American and international sanctions rules. So it's a very broad standard. I might add that these are called activity-based sanctions, and sometimes they're tricky for non-expert organizations to implement, because it's hard to know if a transaction involves an item that's going to go to a nuclear plant or could go to a nuclear plant. But there are some tricks of the trade that will be explained just a little later. There are specific red flags, indeed, that should be watched for, and if found, should trigger an inquiry to the authorities. Moyara will address these in greater detail in just a few moments. Now, there are implementation challenges that I've suggested. First, The sanctions provisions and these efforts to counter proliferation finance have one challenge, is the lack of capacity in many countries. Their banking systems are weak, and they simply don't have a way to execute these requirements to stop these various transactions. There are states that could do more. States that, like China, for example, which took a very tough stand on North Korea after its third nuclear test in terms of curtailing banking access, but it could easily have done that after the first nuclear test. The first test was in 2006. The last test was in 2013. There could have been more done in between to curtail activities of North Korea. Then there are cases where it is simply difficult to execute the sanction. One problem, for example, with an asset freeze is that an asset freeze can be announced by the United States or the UN on one day, and then officials in the foreign ministry that are based either in New York or here in Washington have to communicate back to the home base, to the foreign ministry in their country. The foreign ministry has to then contact the Ministry of Finance, and then banks have to be alerted as another step to actually seize the assets. Well, that can take a week sometimes, whereas moving assets, once a party knows he's can occur in a matter of minutes. So that's another problem executing some of these initiatives. And of course, as I suggested, there are few penalties for noncompliance with many of the requirements, but in other cases, the penalties can be quite severe. And I think any bank or any manufacturer has to be aware that it's not the UN that may come after them, but other parties who may be seeking to fine them or take other action. Let me just note in this last slide, Security Council resolutions, the penalties are just maybe your name gets mentioned. FATF recommendations, there is naming and shaming, and your name can be associated with uncooperativeness, but US sanctions are the ones with the particularly strong penalties in financial terms, and sometimes, of course, could even involve prosecution for a criminal act. Let me now turn things over to Moyara, who will, I think, take us from here. Moyara, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Leonard. All right. Well, as Leonard mentioned earlier, there was this case of pressure transducers, which were illegally shipped to Iran. And that involved a Chinese citizen who deliberately circumvented export controls, arranging to buy over $6 million worth of pressure transducers from an American company, a legitimate American company that likes to make sure it has proper controls in place. Now, for those of us not in the proliferation field, I should mention that pressure transducers are used to regulate gas pressure in centrifuges for uranium enrichment, but they also have legitimate uses. It's one of those dual use items that I mentioned earlier. And this Chinese citizen was ultimately arrested 2 years ago. He was fined $1 million. I don't know what his final sentence was, but the sentencing guidelines call for up to 20 years in prison. Earlier this year, another Chinese national was arrested for a similar crime, exporting numerous dual-use components in addition to pressure transducers after being told that they were being used for a very secret program in Iran. And he still went ahead with the transaction. So how do these middlemen do it? You know, even though these items were prohibited for export to Iran? Well, both individuals made use of shell companies. And I want to pause here for a moment and explain the subtle difference between a front company and a shell company, because the two terms are often used interchangeably. A shell company exists only on paper. There's technically nothing illegal about it, and there are many legitimate legal and commercial purposes for creating a shell company. A front company, on the other hand, can be a shell company, but it could also be a real company with a brick and mortar physical presence. The key is that its purpose is, by definition, designed to deceive and disguise the true originator of the transaction or the end user. Now, according to a recent UN panel of experts report, Iran appears to be using legitimate companies in the oil sector as intermediaries or front companies for the import of dual-use items for their nuclear program. It's a very sly way of obscuring the final end use at one of their facilities. So how can we determine whether the entity we're dealing with is a shell company that is being used as a front? Well, there are many inexpensive online tools for delving deeper into a company's details, and I will share a few of them with you today. One that I like is Panjiva or Panjiva.com, and this can provide company information as well as shipping information. Another one is ImportGenius.com, which is also very similar. Both of these sites do require a membership subscription, but it's not very expensive. You can also look up the company on company registries. Now, not every country has these registries, beneficial ownership registries, or just even company registries that are publicly available, but more countries are coming on board with that. And you can look to see who the nominees are, or in some cases, if you're lucky, the beneficial owners. You can also look to see how long the company has been in existence, although that information can be of use, but can also be deceptive, and I'll talk more about that later. Another one I like is marinetraffic.com. If you have the shipping vessel's IMO number, IMO stands for International Maritime Organization, and there's a lot of information you can find out about that. Even some of those vessels that have been sanctioned by U.S. Treasury for aiding and abetting Iran's nuclear program, many of them are still operating on the high seas. And if you find out that the vessel that's involved in a transaction is one of these sanctioned vessels, then you definitely want to report that. Now, if we could have the next slide, I want to say a few words about shelf companies here. Knowing how long the company has been in existence is no guarantee of its legitimacy, or even if it's really been in existence for that long, because criminals can purchase shelf companies, that shelf with an F at the end. These are shell companies that were officially incorporated many years prior, but they're literally just sitting inactive, like on a shelf, for many years. They cost more, of course. A new shell company might run you as little as $300, but a 5-year-old shelf company might cost 10 times that amount. So it's best not to look only at how long the company has been in existence, but what kind of business have they been conducting during that period of time. If we could have the next slide. If the company has a physical address, look it up. You know, that information will usually be provided in the documentation. You can use simple tools like Google Maps, Google Earth. You could get an aerial view, perhaps even a street view. One of the front companies in the 2012 pressure transducer case I was talking about had an address that was a residential apartment. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. If the customer shares an address with a sanctioned entity, well, then that's definitely grounds for reporting a suspicious transaction. If you're a manufacturer, you're not necessarily required to submit suspicious transactions like financial institutions, but you should definitely inquire further and consult both law enforcement as well as the appropriate ministry in your country, which in the United States would be the Commerce Department. Last year, there was a North Korean ship caught shipping military equipment that was buried under several hundred tons of sugar. They were shipping it from Cuba through the Panama Canal. I'm guessing many of you probably remember that because it was in the news. The shipping company used a front company based in Singapore called Chimpo Shipping Company, which is pictured here in this Google Earth image. Well, an online search of that address would have revealed that this front company shared the same street address as the North Korean embassy in Singapore. So you'd be surprised how these simple online search tools can be invaluable. Whether you're working in the financial sector compliance field or your company selling dual-use items, a lot of the things I've talked about so far fall under standard customer due diligence protocols. At a minimum, you want to know who is your customer, what's their main line of business, who are your customers, typical customers, what are the typical size and types of transactions that they conduct. Have they been consistently shipping oil to East Asia for the past 5 years and suddenly now they're shipping computers or wheat or sugar? Who's on their board of directors? Who is the beneficial owner of the company? Where and when were they incorporated? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking new business customers. And this is for financial institutions as well as manufacturers. It's impossible to engage in risk mitigation unless you have adequate intelligence on your potential customers. Now, speaking of risk mitigation, in the past decade, the world has moved on from a rules-based approach to compliance, where financial institutions were required to do due diligence on every single transaction, regardless of whether it was truly risky or suspicious. And now we're in a risk-based approach whereby financial institutions can just focus their attention in doing enhanced due diligence just on those transactions that they think merit a closer look. So there's more personal judgment at play, and that's opened up opportunities for criminals to exploit, because they can just find a bank or a money transmitter who's willing to exercise what we call in the business willful blindness to the suspiciousness of a transaction. But as we've seen in recent months, even willful blindness is punishable. Many banks, most recently Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, but also Standard Chartered, BNP Paribas, are now facing hundreds of millions of dollars in fines, and in the case of BNP, billions of dollars in fines. And manufacturers can also face steep penalties, and as well as serious damage to their reputation if they're found to have willfully disregarded export control rules. So how do you protect your company or your institution from these kinds of risks? Well, in addition to investigating new customers, it's important to monitor high-risk transactions. And that's especially true for high-risk customers like shipping companies or manufacturers of dual-use materials. Financial institutions are regularly in the business of financing trade transactions. It should become a standard matter of course to ask customers if the products are sensitive dual-use materials, whether they know who the ultimate end user is, whether they have end user certification, whether they have the required export licenses. Those kinds of questions might have seemed intrusive in the past, but the world has definitely changed. Now, if the transaction is deemed suspicious, all of those details should be included in your report. Those members of our audience who are working at US banks, you would file a SAR or Suspicious Activity Report. But all of our overseas audience members might be more familiar with STRs or Suspicious Transaction Reports. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to these reports as STRs. And I want to say that an STR without actionable intelligence is not helpful at all. We also need to remember that STRs have important historical value. So even if an investigation is launched 3 years after the STR is submitted, that information can still be valuable in catching and prosecuting the criminals. So you want to include all of the important details in those STRs that might end up being useful. So what would be grounds for suspicion? Well, let's say that the customer or the counterparty shares an address with a sanctioned entity, as we saw in the pressure transducer case. what if the stated activity doesn't match the original business profile? So for example, the shipping company used to ship grain exclusively, or maybe crude petroleum. Now it's transporting electronics. That might not be grounds alone for filing an STR, but you should at the very least call up, make a few phone calls, and find out what's going on here, because it is unusual. Maybe the destination is odd, or you're shipping electronics from a location that doesn't even have an electronics industry. In fact, these two examples are both from the U.S. Commerce Department's website, where they do offer some examples of very odd red flags for some of these types of transactions. Maybe the customer is vague about the purpose of the transaction, or maybe he or she is resistant about providing more information when you start asking questions. That then requires more enhanced due diligence. Maybe the financing is complex, with layered letters of, or multiple letters of credit from many different sources, or layered shell companies, which I'm going to mention in another slide, or multiple intermediaries. Or maybe the delivery route is really complex and not consistent with normal geographic trade patterns. If an order was placed in country A by a company in country B for shipment to country C rather than the original country A, that's grounds for suspicion and worth a closer look. Or maybe you have extra or unnecessary links in the supply chain that serve no reasonable purpose. In that case, file a suspicious transaction report. Now, I want to finish up in my discussion of red flags with three more things. With layered shell companies, this is a situation where the beneficial owner of the shell company is another shell company. And you can have multiple layers where you have a shell company that then incorporates another shell company, which then incorporates another shell company. Criminals do this from time to time to deliberately make the investigative process more difficult if anybody wanted to discover who the true beneficial owner is. I'm really hard pressed to think of any legitimate reason for having layered shell companies other than to hide something. So layered shell companies, I think, is a really important red flag, which you don't see in a lot of guidelines and lists that, say, the Commerce Department might provide. Maybe the shipping cost is too high for the declared value of the goods. Why would you spend $100,000 to ship $1 million worth of goods? It just doesn't make sense. Maybe there's some inconsistencies with names, addresses, or final destination between the documents, the financing documents, the bill of lading, and it just doesn't add up. So to practice some of what we've just discussed now, I'd like to present a hypothetical case. And I want you to see if you can spot some of the potential red flags and consider whether you would process the payment or file a suspicious transaction report. So here we have a case where your bank in Nairobi is being asked by a local shipping company to process payments for some pressure transducers, which we now know is a dual use item, from a manufacturer in China. But I should point out that this is a subsidiary of a legitimate US company with a good reputation to an end user in Tajikistan. The shipment is being transported on a tanker that normally carries chemical products, and it's operated by this Nefertiti shipping company in Egypt. The original order was paid with 2 wire transfers, one from Asia Bank in Moscow and another wire transfer from Golden Resource Trading Company in Dubai. And it's being delivered first to Mombasa where it's going to be transferred to another vessel, and then the bank's being asked to process payments to Cylinder Systems. Now, Cylinder Systems sounds like a legitimate company that might be requiring pressure transducers or might be in the business of shipping pressure transducers. And finally, they're being transported by air. They're being flown to Tajikistan. Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at each of these and see where the red flags are. We already know pressure transducers are a dual use item. What about Tajikistan? Might Tajikistan have any industry that might need pressure transducers for legitimate reasons? Tajikistan is also right next to Iran. The other thing that we can look at are these IMO numbers. Now, you don't even have to search on those sites that I mentioned earlier to you, like marinetraffic.com. Instead, what I'm going to ask you to do, you can do this just on your own, is to do a search of this IMO number, do IMO and then the number and then the word sanctions in Google. If you just do the IMO number by itself, you're going to get a lot of information, legitimate information about this ship, because this ship is still operating on the high seas. But if you type in the word sanctions, what you'll get is all kinds of information about why the U.S. Treasury, in real life, this is a real vessel with a real IMO number, sanctioned this vessel for aiding and abetting Iran's nuclear program. And the same thing is true for Nefertiti Shipping Company. That company is also on the U.S. sanctions list. Now, something that I neglected to circle here is that the order was paid for with 2 wire transfers coming from 2 different companies and locations. That's pretty suspicious as well. Why 2 wire transfers, and why from 2 completely different entities that don't seem to be related? If you also did a Google search on Asia Bank or Chemexim Bank, you would find that this is neither one of these is a Russian bank. It's actually an Iranian bank, and it is indeed on the U.S. sanctions list. And the same is true for Golden Resources Trading Company. It's also a company that's on the U.S. sanctions list. Note that I did not circle Dubai in the previous slide, and that's because while I joke with my students that all paths lead to Dubai, Dubai is the most important transshipment point in the Middle East and very big re-export center. So there's nothing unusual about it, but that particular company was definitely high risk. Mombasa, that doesn't make sense from a geographic standpoint. Why ship it to Mombasa first? This other vessel, Gas Camellia, also still operating on the high seas, but if you type it in with the word sanctions, you'll see that it is on the Treasury sanctions list. Same thing with Cylinder Systems in Croatia, sanctioned for aiding and abetting Iran's nuclear program. And finally, Tajikistan. So we have a lot of different red flags in this particular case study. Finally, I want to end with just reminding all of us to trust our instincts. When you're conducting any investigation, if your instinct tells you that something isn't right, file an SDR or pick up the phone and call the company that's receiving the order. You would be surprised how often a criminal case is uncovered because a suspicious banking compliance professional or a suspicious supplier picked up the phone to ask a few clarifying questions. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague. Leonard, would you like to wrap things up?
Thank you.
Oh, actually, I do
just
want to
wanted
answer this
to
question.
take a couple of...
Leonard, do you mind if I answer the question about flags of convenience? I don't consider them a red
Please
flag
go ahead.
because they're so widespread in use.
There are
Okay.
some countries that are flags of convenience that are actually becoming fairly disciplined about not reflagging Iranian vessels. Not all of them, however. let's just talk about next steps as we wrap up. For governments, clearly what we want to see done is full implementation of the existing mandates. These are the UN Security Council resolutions, the US sanctions, and other items where many countries are simply not implementing them at all, and others, as we said earlier, may not be implementing them as effectively and as efficiently and as aggressively as they really should be. So that's a big gap right now. A lot of countries are doing the right thing, but there are others that are lagging. Financial institutions, I think the lesson here is screen as actively as you can, and that's true for manufacturers as well. It turns out that these activities are going on, that is to say, the screening activities in many banks, especially because of the risks they face if something gets through the cracks and they have not done due diligence when they should. Manufacturers as well. One positive dimension is that if you do have a robust and active screening program and something does inadvertently get through the system and you wind up financing a transaction that should not have been financed, if you can demonstrate you've been trying hard to avoid that and that this was not intentional, the presence of a robust internal compliance program is a mitigating factor that will be taken into account by authorities that may be investigating. Finally, for the non-proliferation community, I think we've seen in the case of Iran that these financial sanctions of various kinds can have a pretty big impact. It's quite possible that we are seeing the results here with Iran coming to the negotiating table because of this very wide range of interventions through financial means that are affecting their economy and also these individual transactions. And let me just close with one final point, if I may. If we go to the next slide. And that is a way of looking at this situation is that there are sort of two effects of the tools that we've been describing. One is to go after individual transactions, and for sure that's desirable, and we want to use red flags, and we want to try to stop these as much as we can. But there's a second impact, which is that if broad screening is taking place in the banking sector, in the insurance sector, in the shipping sector, in the manufacturing sector, it means that the pathway for illicit transactions is going to be filled with obstacles that the country involved that's seeking the goods, has to overcome. And that means they have to start off by trying to use shell companies and circuitous routes and all the rest, and it slows the process down. And this can have a significant impact even if individual transactions make their way through the system. So the broad impact is quite worthwhile in terms of achieving. What we may see in the end, if we're lucky, is that we do delay some of these programs, and we can delay them using these tools until other tools can come along, diplomacy and other measures, to persuade countries to turn away from their nuclear programs. I think we're seeing that in Iran at the present time, with some of the broad gauge financial sanctions having a big impact, even as the other activities that we want to stop are being pursued with the more fine-grained sanctions efforts. That, I think, will kind of wrap us up for the evening. What we're going to try to do now is open the chat section for questions. We'll be happy to pursue matters with you further. We went through quite a bit of material, and I'm sure that there are some ambiguities and other items that we can try to clarify for you if you wish to write a question down for us. And we'll be watching the chat box for another few minutes to see if we get organized, and be happy to reply. Melissa, I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear you. I mean, Moyara. There you are, yes.
Okay,
now I can
you
hear you.
hear me now? All right, okay.
Yes.
The first question is, If a bank clerk has filed an STR, will the money need to be held by the bank? I assume they mean frozen. It all depends. It all depends. If the transaction is especially suspicious, most banks will pick up the phone, call law enforcement, and ask for advice on what to do. If a particular customer is engaging in one or more suspicious transactions, some banks prefer to close the account rather than risk being attached to any kind of suspicious transaction that might end up in the newspapers, for example. Law enforcement typically does not like them to close the account. Law enforcement wants them to keep the account open. But now banks, of course, are nervous that, well, what about the liability issues? If some illegal transaction does take place, we don't want to be connected to it. So they can get a letter that exempts them from liability. And not all of them go ahead and do that, but it is quite helpful to law enforcement when they do that, because what law enforcement wants is the ability to carefully watch and track all the transactions going through those particular accounts. So that's why it's really helpful to keep those accounts open. But again, involve law enforcement. Definitely involve law enforcement in your deliberations of whether or not you need to complete the transaction or freeze the transaction. That's your best option.
I see a couple of individuals are typing. Let's wait till they send us their messages.
While they're asking their questions, I should mention that all of you who have participated today, we can send you a link to these slides, as well as provide you with additional resources if you're interested. We provided our contact information if any of you have follow-up, but we encourage you to ask questions now. The question has to do with recommendation 7, if they're using that to develop their own national laws. Yes, and most of these countries are very cognizant of how well they measure up to these FATF 40 recommendations, because they're getting evaluated by their peers, typically countries within their region who are part of their FATF regional style body. Most of these countries are getting evaluated ideally every 5 years. It doesn't always happen that way. And their existing laws and regulations are held up for scrutiny against this relatively new set of 40 recommendations, and they're given a report card. And how well they measure up gets inputted into risk scoring software programs that banks and other institutions use. And if a country rates as high risk, that's going to slow down transactions to and from that country, and nobody wants that to happen. We want the wheels of commerce to move smoothly. Here we have a question: is if an STR is filed and the transaction turns out to be legitimate, does that reported STR affect the company anyway, even in terms of reputation? No. What happens with these STRs or SARs is they get filed with each country's financial intelligence unit. Most countries of the world now have a functioning financial intelligence unit. And these FIUs will review the STRs that come in periodically and decide which ones merit further investigation. Then they will indeed investigate. Nothing about these STRs or SARs is ever made public. In fact, it's against the law in most countries to reveal any information from those STRs or SARs. It has to be held very top secret, confidential, And it's just a starting point, if you will, of actionable intelligence that law enforcement can then use to do further investigation. So no one's reputation is going to be harmed unless that investigation leads to some illegitimate activity. You're welcome. I think we have 2 more questions coming in. Leonard, I'm going to let you answer this one. If Iran and North Korea are the only countries of concern.
Well, there are other countries that we need to keep an eye on, so to speak. In the nuclear realm, it's countries that are not parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India, Pakistan, and Israel. They are under embargoes of different kinds, and typically the items that were relevant to nuclear programs are under fairly strict controls. Licenses are issued, and India was recently given a special status which allows it greater access to civilian nuclear energy. But these are countries that are sanctioned in various ways, apropos of their nuclear activities, often with a ban on supporting those nuclear activities. So one has to be careful in those cases as well. And I'd say Syria is a country, of course now it's embroiled in this nasty, horrifying civil war, but certainly in the past, you would have said that's a particularly important country because of a chemical weapon program. Right now, those chemicals seem to have been fully destroyed, and we don't see a lot of chemical programs around the world. The other one of concern is in North Korea, frankly, which we're already watching for so many other reasons. So I'd say there's some other countries to be attentive to, but the place where the most activity is occurring, the assault on the banking system, the assault on our export licensing activities, and ours, I mean all of us listening and participating today, those are North Korea and Iran by far.
Okay. Leonard, we also have a question about the AQCon network and how might financial institutions have prevented the AQCon network from spreading nuclear technology. So this is in reference to one of the most seminal cases that we have of WMD proliferation. Would you like to address that?
Well, the bank that was largely used by AQCon, certainly for a period of his activities, was BCC, if I recall. There's a fourth letter, BCCI, I think, International. It was a bank that itself was a fraudulent enterprise. And so he was able to exploit this because it was a place where no questions were asked. I think today the international banking system has become more disciplined, and banks of that nature typically have trouble engaging in the international banking system. But there were so many international transactions that he was involved in, transactions involving Western Europe, involving Malaysia, involving Japan, South Africa. This was a real failure of the financial control system as well as the export control systems. And I think as time has passed, we've all become wiser and more capable in terms of our ability to respond. But you're quite right to identify that as a flaw in the way we managed, tried to deal with AQCon. Of course, we didn't know about it, but perhaps if we had been more attentive, we would have seen telltale signs in the financial side of things, even if we missed them on the export control side. And one of the Sanctions Committee panels of experts has pointed that out, that is, the financial side gives you completely different but very important clues to some of this illegal activity.
Mm-hmm. We also have another question here that is right up your alley, Leonard, and it has to do with which could be considered the most important international regimes in order to comply with Resolution 1540. So I think what he means is maybe organizations like Egmont Group. And yes, the question is, what is Egmont Group linked with the financial intelligence units? Yes. Egmont Group is the ability for financial intelligence units that are considered to be fully functioning and legitimate. It allows them to exchange information between countries. So, Leonard, would you like to address the question on compliance with Resolution 1540?
This is, we have a non-proliferation specialist speaking to you and a banking specialist. So I'm the former. But what I would understand is that to comply with 1540, the best approach for a country to take is to identify the most respected set of rules and regulations internationally, and then adopt them domestically. So for example, if you are trying to control nuclear goods, it makes sense to use a list that's been in use, let's say in the European Union, or that's promulgated by the Nuclear Suppliers Group. If you're watching for chemical and biological issues, you'd want to use the Australia Group instead of independently trying to develop them, a country doing it on its own. It's not necessary. And I'd say in the financial side, it's the rules of the Financial Action Task Force. Many of the rules apply to money laundering and to counterterrorism financing. But fundamentally, they're very similar to what you would want to do in the proliferation area. It's the same kind of screening, using many of the same tools. I'd say for money laundering, as I understand it, there are behaviors of the way deposits are made, the way withdrawals are made that kind of give some clues as to what's going on. You won't really see that in the proliferation area. But I'd say if you adopted the guidance of the Financial Action Task Force deliberately, you would find yourself doing quite well in terms of complying with the broader non-proliferation standards and discipline.
We have another question having to do with, who is ultimately responsible for doing enhanced due diligence on these transactions. The bank compliance officer, are they responsible for doing this, or do they assume that the individual company or manufacturer has already had their compliance persons already conducted it? Well, all of these different players in the process should be doing some due diligence. The bank compliance officer can only do due diligence with the information that they have at hand, which will be somewhat limited. Most of these large manufacturers that produce dual-use items do have an in-house compliance department, and so they do try to do enhanced due diligence on who they work with, especially when they have a new customer.
Well, I think there are two different types of information. The financial information, the use of multiple letters of credit, things of this type, may be more likely to appear and show up when a bank does its due diligence. And certain questions about whether the company is an appropriate company to be purchasing this particular object may be more likely for the compliance officer at the manufacturer to pick up. So I think you want to see both sides working. I don't know that there's collaboration yet. I think each side has a lot on its plate. But clearly, if you have discipline on both sides, that is to say in the banking financial side and on the manufacturing side, there's a much greater likelihood that we'll find the transactions that we want to stop.
And we have another question about the how can coordination between the financial community and Export Control Authority be strengthened, especially in the area of non-proliferation? I think that's an excellent question. I would really love to see the trade financing side of these financial institutions become more involved in doing enhanced due diligence and reporting suspicious transactions. I'm not so sure that the trade financing folks are really accustomed to reporting suspicious transactions as much as other areas of the bank. And would they call up the export control authorities, I don't know, but they should have their number. Leonard, do you want to add anything to that?
We've only spoke about the banking and the manufacturing side, but there are other players as well. And I think the need for coordination, or if we could execute coordination, would really be quite valuable. You have insurers that are involved, and the shipping companies themselves are also watching, we hope, for suspicious transactions. And I don't think there's a clearinghouse. I guess the clearinghouse is reporting up the chain into the law enforcement side of things. In the United States, all of the various agencies involved in strategic trade control enforcement, and it includes the Treasury, so that's also the financial side, they coordinate through a new body that's been created, the Export Control Enforcement Court. It's E2C2, so I guess it's the Export Enforcement Coordinating Committee. And that's one way that maybe this can be done. In other words, maybe not in the private sector so much, but when the private sector reports into the governmental sector, that at that stage the coordination occurs. And I think we're seeing in the United States at least an effort to achieve that.
Okay. We have a question here about perhaps export control officials can contribute to banks' risk-based analysis. What do you think?
I think, well, one thing that is clearly recommended in many different settings is that for banks to do their job properly, they have to have as much information as possible from the government, because it's the government intelligence and law enforcement officials who are going to know which parties to watch. They may not be published, or may not be public, but they'll have a sense of who to keep an eye on. And they'll be looking for transactions involving these individuals, and they'll know the kinds of goods, for example, that a country like Iran or North Korea is seeking. So it's important for the government to pass that information on to the banks and to the manufacturers so that everybody can be alert and have the same kind of readiness to act as the government might have. So I think that's one area where when you look at recommendations, including the FATF recommendations, there is this objective of having the governments share more.
All right. Well, we've gone a little bit over our time, but thank you all for staying with us here past the hour. And I should have mentioned also, in addition to the slides, we are recording this webinar. And so if you know anyone who you think might be interested or find this valuable, we can provide a link to the recording if they were unable to make it to this particular presentation. Leonard, do you want to add anything before we close?
No, I just say our contact information is in front of you, and we'd be very happy to correspond further. Or if you are having difficulty finding, I guess they should go to our website, as I understand it, which would be CNS eLearning at MIIS.edu. That's one place to look for the material. And another, I guess, would be to go to the Center for Nonproliferation Studies website itself, which is nonproliferation.org. But we'd be very pleased to work with you further or to provide additional resources that we're aware of if you would like us to help out. And we do thank you all for joining us. It's we're very glad to see so many folks on the list and so many interesting questions.
Thank you.
All right, let's say goodbye then.
Bye-bye.
Sign off.